All right, good morning, everybody. Let's get after it here. It is Friday, April 9th. We are back in studio rounding up the biggest headlines of the week. I am Josh Durso. I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, we are back. We have a state budget. Things are looking normal-ish in Albany. And I say that because dysfunctional is the new normal. Let's start with the budget and how much of a mess it was. It was late. It was really expensive, $212 billion. There was a lot of debate about what the focus points were of that budget. You obviously had a lot of spending on small business recovery, rent, and mortgage relief, childcare, education, a big boost for actual aid to schools, which was welcome to a lot of local districts. And then a fund for immigrant workers who did not get the federal stimulus payments, which was kind of a political football that was getting thrown back and forth. What was your biggest takeaway from the budget process? Big success, big miss. What were you seeing?
Well, two primary things. Number one is this process is still terrible. It's
awful.
Top heavy. It involves the governor too much, the Democratic leaders too much. Most of the legislators, not at all. I had Assemblyman Mankelo on this week. He was on the thruway heading to Albany. He said, we're going to take up two bills today, but I don't know what they are. I'll find out when I get there. Nobody reads this thing. They're voting on hundreds and thousands of pages of bills that they're not reading, and it's just a mess. I don't understand why we're the only state in the nation that doesn't have a legislature that proposes bills, passes them or doesn't pass them, and then the governor signs it or doesn't sign it. It's still Andrew Cuomo's budget with almost nobody else's input. That's number one. And then number two is, we were talking about this the other day, it occurred to me, whether it's the state budget or presidential State of the Union addresses, they always include these soaring, transformative programs that's going to make life as we know it just a wonderful thing. Do any of them ever happen? They're talking about broadband internet, for Pete's sake. 10 years ago, how do we get broadband internet? Spectrum, the phone company, or maybe a couple other choices. Today, how do we get high-speed internet? Spectrum, the phone company, a couple other choices. It hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. Senator Gillibrand talks about broadband. Schumer talks about broadband. Cuomo talks about broadband. So there's always just these big, sweeping, transformative changes to life, and then you look back a few years later and they don't take place. So you ask yourself, where does all this money go? Our budget spends, I think it's more than California or close to California, which has double the population. What are we getting for this $212 billion?
Yeah, and I think sort of piggybacking off of that with how dominant marijuana legalization and mobile sports betting, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, were in terms of driving the whole budget. I mean, those seem to be two of the only issues that we heard talked about other than, instituting some new taxes on the wealthy. Earners make over $1 million, $5 million, sort of creating these new brackets. It was interesting. There were a couple different things that stuck out to me. One, Bill Hammond tweeted out, I thought maybe the most eye-opening piece of information that a lot of people tend to not look at when we get this deep into the budget process, which is what were the actual numbers in recent years. And he tweeted out the 2019, 2020, 2021 comparison of those 3 years. And we're effectively at like a almost 30% increase in spending. You go back 3 years and the budget was $172 billion and now we're at $212 billion.
In a pandemic where economic activity is depressed, and where's that revenue coming from? You can tax all the millionaires you want.
And that also, let's not forget, that also includes federal money that was passed down. So even if you take that money out, you're still looking at a dramatic increase overall from what we were spending just a couple of years ago. And I think there's a portion of the population that feels very comfortable with increasing the spend if you're going to be doing more. But my issue, again, with this particular budget is whether you're concerned about, equity, socioeconomic equity, whether you're concerned about making New York a safer, better place to live, whether you're concerned about, and look on both sides of the aisle, what are the big ticket items that we always hear talked about? I don't think anybody exits this process happy. I don't think any of those, call them access issues, are fixed. And I don't think there's, to your point, you have these like big ticket ideas, like you have these big ticket ideas that wind up becoming flashy press releases, but you don't really have any substance in there that actually fixes those things. And the other issue too, and we saw it last year because of the pandemic, we're almost to a point now, and it seems like there's been a pretty big shift over the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of the budget being like the only substantial legislative like movement in the calendar year. I can recall back in 2014, 2015, even early 2016, where it seemed like there was more activity. And maybe it was because I was a little greener and a little less sort of connected to what was happening on the day-to-day. But I genuinely believe that there is less legislating happening present day, or even in the last 2 years, go back to before the pandemic happened in 2019, than we saw even 5 or 6 years ago. I really believe that.
I think that's accurate. There isn't much after the budget because they put, for example, marijuana legalization. That's not a budget issue. No. If it passes, it becomes one, sure, because you have to set up the licensing and how's the retail going to work and all those things. But otherwise, it's a social piece of legislation. You pass it or you don't pass it. That should be a bill introduced in the Senate or Assembly, passed by one house, passed by the other house, sent to the governor. But it's our legislators, our rank and file, especially the predominantly Republican rank and file legislators we have upstate, they don't have any idea what's going on other than whatever pieces of scuttlebutt they can pick up. I mean, Brian Manktolow's literally driving out to work wondering what bills he's going to have dropped in his desk. And Brian Kolb, when I used to have him on, talked about it all the time. Yep. They plop a 700-page bill down on your desk and say the vote's in 10 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, I think it's interesting how some of these different items get wrapped in. So you just mentioned the marijuana legalization, and you say, well, that's not a budget item until it becomes law, right? Well, everything is driven by money and revenue now. Like every legislative action that the state seems to take is based on or derived from money, period. And that seems to be the only way. Like we don't apparently govern on ideas or, actual policies or improving life or anything like that. It's all money. Like a great example of that in my mind is the rent and mortgage relief that was packed into this budget and made out to be this thing that had to be legislated by our legislators in Albany or the governor. It's federal money that was already doled out to New York State, that was already earmarked for rent and mortgage relief, specifically to help mom and pop landlords. There was nothing for state legislators to do with that. Just make it happen. Just facilitate. That's all you had to do. That's all the state had to do was facilitate. And it turns into this budget thing where like there needs to be, bipartisan support and there needs to be this like what? No, there doesn't. It's already done. Stop creating more bureaucracy in a system that's already ripe with it. Like let's move forward. And the other interesting, you've got sort of these like polarizing topics, taxing the wealthy. People who make over $1 million, $5 million, whatever the case may be. I realize that there is a desire to make sure that everybody is paying their fair share. And I also realize and am willing to admit that Republicans use like any tax increase ever just as basically something to yell and scream about without having any, true substantive reason for doing so. Because the reality is like anybody who makes more than $1 million a year has the means to freely leave New York State if they so choose, or find a way to get around paying that tax. And I think, if we've learned anything over the last year with the state of our financial world, with billionaires becoming wealthier than they ever were before during the pandemic, it's that if you have money, you can find ways around certain tax expenses. And, you can say, well, that's either fine or it's not fine, whatever the case may be. But, you get so lost, I think some of the state's legislators get so lost. Maybe it's because they feel like they don't have that power or that authority in actually shaping the conversation in Albany, that they just hammer these easy items. And it's like, you're not helping the situation either. I think there could be a substantive conversation that happens, or maybe even better working together between the two parties if Republicans, along with Democrats, didn't just do the fall into our corner and yell the things that are on that bullet list over there that both of our parties love to yell about all the time.
Well, and then we also have the interest groups. I laugh because every year I swear sometimes the responses to the budget are written before the budget actually comes out, because they already know what it's going to be. The education people say there's not enough education money. Farm Bureau says there's not enough farm money. This organization, that organization says there should be more money for our thing. The bottom line, what this all leads to, and I think it's by design, is disengagement. The public, we look at the state budget, this thing affects every aspect of our lives, and most people's eyes glaze over and they go, oh yeah, the budget. Yeah, it was late again this year, wasn't it? Okay, and that's all they know and that's all they care. And again, I believe that's by design. That's how powerful people stay powerful, is by discouraging the public from having any involvement in it. I don't understand why there isn't a real uprising in New York that we get back to having a real legislature. I mean, with all due respect, I don't know if there's a weaker state legislature in any of the 50 states than there is in New York. With the exception of a handful of people, my joke this year was 3 guys in a Zoom. It just hasn't changed, and every year we hear this is the year and this is an outrage and we're going to change it. Never does.
Well, and so you mentioned education, and there was a lot of cheering after certain districts started to get more money, or they felt like they got a better share in aid than they have in the past or in past budgets. And it's like, if you look at the districts that are really struggling, or you look at the districts that have a real core issue, I'm thinking like Rochester, you look at some of your districts that are in similar shape to that. It's not about the spend. It's about how it's spent. And it's about how those schools are shaped. And it's about like, it's so much more than the money. But like right now, this is a good example of a time when, a lot of lawmakers in New York State, as well as the governor, are going to, throw their fist down on the desk and say, we did it. And that's just it's not an accurate representation of what governing and legislating should look like in this state or anywhere. It doesn't matter.
And the question is also, what strings are tied to the money? Right. I mean, it's education is probably one of the most bureaucratically complicated things in the whole world. I remember several years ago, as a Scout merit badge advisor, I had a group of Boy Scouts at a school board meeting, and there was some program where the district, my home district, Marcus Whitman, was going to get some money for something, and they decided not to take it because it would be way too complicated to comply with everything they had to comply with to get it. Yeah. They just decided, you know what, this isn't enough money for all of the nonsense we have to go through to get it. Having said that, overall, I mean, it does sound like for the first time in a long time, that schools and the school organizations are largely happy with the way education aid came out.
Yeah. My issue is I think that's just a temporary, because are they going to get enough of an increase next year, the year after that, the year after that? A lot of these money issues have been going on for like a decade plus.
And we still have the question in our rural districts here in the Finger Lakes of the declining population. I mean,
and how are those schools going to continue?
How are you going to continue on when you had 1,100 people in your district a few years ago, and now it's 800, and in 3 years it's going to be 600?
Yeah. So we've got recreational marijuana, like I said, included in the budget, legalized, effective immediately. The licensing process is going to take some time. Probably not going to see any licenses until early to mid 2022, so you won't see any retail environments popping up. To that end, municipalities, towns, villages can also opt out if they so choose, and only opt out of the zoning portion of this, we'll call it, the retail portion of it. So the Auburn Citizen actually had a really good story this yesterday or the day before about this topic and how different villages and towns are starting to have a conversation about what that's going to mean. So a couple questions for you, Ted. One, any surprises in the bill itself or in the legalization part of it? And then second, what do you think about the possibility that a village or a town could say no, even though there are consequences to that?
I'm not really too surprised with anything in the bill. I've said for a long time, people put substances in their body, and I don't understand the completely different approach. If I take a plant material and liquefy it and call it beer, perfectly legal, perfectly socially acceptable for decades. If I take a plant material and light it on fire and inhale it, oh my God, what's the difference? At the end of the day, really, what's the difference? What's the difference between a retail pot shop and the microbreweries I like to visit? Other than the fact that alcohol of the two has the far more damaging properties long term than pot ever will. So I don't... But it's going to become a political football. All the people on the right are going to scream about it. Law enforcement has some legitimate issues and some, I think, not so much. I mean, they're going to have to deal with it in terms of impaired driving and things like that. But I've just never been able to understand that completely disparate treatment of two substances that really aren't that different, alcohol and pot.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I have two issues. The impaired driving part that you mentioned, I don't think law enforcement has a good enough way to determine whether someone's driving under the influence of a drug as they do with a breathalyzer system.
Well, and that's going to be there's a big money-making opportunity because somebody's going to come up with a test and develop it and sell it and make $1 billion.
I want to say that a Victor-based company, I think, is working on that now, owned by Tom Golisano, or at least he's a stock interest or something to that effect. But so you've got that part of it, because I think the subjective nature of having drug recognition experts, given the current attitude around policing in general in communities, I don't think for a second that that's going to be a reliable long-term solution to this. Maybe in the short term they can lean on that, but I think there's going to need to be a sort of mechanical solution to determining whether someone's impaired or not.
And I think the other question, and I don't know the answer to this, I don't know if it's been around long enough to have decent figures in places like Massachusetts, does overall use really increase that much?
Yeah,
I suspect that it probably will some, but I don't think it'll be that much. It isn't like everybody's going to run around and go down to the local pot shop. I think it's going to largely be fairly similar use to what it was in the past, which means people are already driving stoned.
Right.
So it isn't, I don't see it as becoming a big epidemic problem that's going to increase.
I do have the other part of that, or the other issue I guess I have with how the law was proposed, is giving local municipalities the capacity to opt out I think you're creating, in a lot of different ways, I think you're creating winners and losers in that scenario, especially on the money side of it. Obviously, you're pushing communities one direction or another, and they could potentially lose money. But then on top of that, also, you could have this back and forth situation where, like, one administration decides to, saying administration, like you could have one mayor or one supervisor who says no. You could have another 4 years later or 2 years later say yes, and could literally go back and forth. And it's all driven by, it's just a local law. So within this bill that was ultimately included in the budget, local municipalities have until the end of the year to create a local law that either allows or does not allow these types of retail establishments to enter their community.
Well, we've had that really already for decades with dry counties. I mean, you don't see that as much here in the Northeast. I lived in Texas for a number of years. I lived in a dry county, and it was 11 miles to the county line, and every Friday and Saturday night there was a big line of traffic driving 11 miles to the county line. So that's what you're going to have, is you're going to have towns opt out, and then people are going to go to the next town over where it's legal.
Which does create, I think...
Which then creates people on the road with these intoxicating substances.
A more concerning vehicle and traffic concern than the other scenario.
So I think people who want to ban it might not be doing the good that they think they are. They might actually be creating more harm.
Well, and I think that'll especially be the case in communities where there's either, well, I'll just say it, a college campus. And that is going to be a big question mark. And also, you know, again, with all these different layers of government that you ultimately have now being involved in this conversation, you know, you think about a scenario where a town could say yes, but a village within it could say no. And a school could, inside of that, also have a separate set of rules, or I should say, will, I guess, have to have a separate set of rules, because I believe, if I heard correctly a couple days ago, any entity or any organization that receives federal money, because it's still illegal, federally speaking, cannot allow it to happen on their, I got to find the exact details out on that one, but like that's the kind of scenario that I heard discussed a couple days ago.
Well, that's 100 lawsuits waiting to happen.
You know, and it just creates, again, it creates all of this complexity around something that at its core, when people said we should legalize recreational use of marijuana, was not intended to be this complicated thing at all. Mobile sports betting. It's happened. It also is going to take some time to get running. We've got a competitive bid process that's going to be playing out. So there's going to be like a couple vendors for the state that are allowed to operate in New York. Probably DraftKings and FanDuel, just guessing, but probably going to be those. Or maybe someone else comes along with a big wad of money to try and shut one of those two companies out of New York, which I think would be really interesting to watch. About time. One is my only thought. And then the other thing, I guess, as well is, you know, way to make this really complicated and unnecessarily messy, because people have been placing, I'm not going to say names, but like almost everybody I know who is into betting in general or sports betting in general has been placing mobile bets illegally for a long time. It's not new. And you know, creating more of a delay, creating more bureaucracy around it, is just defeating the purpose. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sports bettor, so it's not of any interest to me one way or the other, but just get out of the way.
Yep.
There are, like you say, there are companies who do this. Pass the law, say it's legal, and then get out of the way. But the one thing that we have seen that Andrew Cuomo is not going to ever do is get out of the way. So he's going to have himself in there, and he's going to issue press releases, and if you place a sports bet, you'll have to buy a bag of chips, and Lord knows what else.
So we're going to switch to a couple pandemic-related items here. First up, schools are going back to in-person learning, kind of, sort of. Some of them are. What do we take from the state's silence? They say they're going to have a decision within less than a week now. But there hasn't been, and I think we're like almost a month removed now from the CDC's guidance that 3 feet is fine. You don't need to do the 6 feet thing. We've also heard now that from the CDC that very, very small, slim, minor chances of transmission of the virus on hard surfaces. So another, blow. And then on top of that, vaccinations are skyrocketing. So, what do you take from the silence, and what does it mean, other than this may be another example of what we've been talking about already, where the governor is effectively waiting to make a grand announcement?
I think a lot of people are trying to avoid making a tough decision and are hoping they can kick the can down the road. I said a long time ago, and I really still feel that way, I think we're looking at Labor Day in terms of returns to normalcy. Talking to Susie Monaghan from the Smith this morning, they've got a show coming, live show, 100 tickets, but in terms of any tours, she said it's going to be 2022.
Right.
How's a band going to put together a tour when you're going through 7 states that have 7 different sets of rules? I really think the hope is that when we go through the summer, that by the end of the summer, maybe the vaccination rate is something like 20% now, maybe it's 40 or 50% or more by then. We're getting close to herd immunity. So I really think, I think a lot of people, maybe not the governor, but I think a lot of people involved in education would be perfectly happy to see this year finish out the way it is, and then we all come back in September and say, okay, either we've got a handle on this thing, let's return to normal, or we don't, and go from there. But the same thing with the sports crowds. I mean, we're still, even though the state guidance has opened up, most of the local colleges, to my knowledge, are still not allowing anybody. Most of the local high schools are still allowing maybe 2 per person. I did a high school football game last night, maybe 30 people there. So I think everybody's kind of saying, you know what, we're almost to summer. Hang in there, let's get to summer, let's go through summer, and then see what the world looks like on the backside.
Yeah, and I agree with that, even to the end of, I'm not sure administrators have the capacity at this point, because they're still having to deal with normal end of year stuff. They're trying to figure out what their graduation ceremonies are going to look like. And really, we've only, we're almost to mid-April. Realistically, we're only looking at about a month of school left, real school left. So I'm not really sure there's any motivation to make a big swing.
Because even if you did, like you said, how long would it take to ramp up? I mean, teachers who haven't been in front of an actual classroom in months, how long is it going to take everybody to get ramped up and get the bus schedules worked out for full bus transportation? A lot of moving pieces. It isn't like you can just snap your finger and say school returns to normal on April 15th.
Well, and again, I think a lot of districts that have more residents in them who would like to see full-time in-person learning have effectively full-time in-person learning already. They're either going 4 or 5 days, Seneca Falls, places like that. So I'm not sure there's much to change. It's where you're seeing this debate really divisively play out or in your cities, right? Or in your more populated suburbs. And, like you said, I think the fall, that's probably going to be when this thing really takes a shift and we'll see normal happen. But I would also like to throw the caveat out that, I'll say a good chunk of the people who I've heard criticize the fact that students aren't back to school yet, or school leaders for not bringing students back full time yet, are also going to be, I think, very frustrated with what's going to be a vaccine mandate in the fall.
There's still a lot of reluctance, too. I mean, I keep reminding myself, my life didn't change that much. I go to work in my station. I work in my regular workplace. I've been going to restaurants since we were allowed to in June. My life hasn't changed all that much. A lot of people's have. There are still a lot of people who don't want to come out of their homes. They're still afraid. They don't want to go to work. They want to work from home. They want to stay home. So even if we throw the schools open, we might see 30% of parents say no thanks and not send their kids.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty fair assessment, because, and my only curiosity is, and as we've talked about before, how much of the population is that? What percentage is that? Is that 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%? I don't think it's at the higher end of that scale. I think at the end of the day, the people who are, much like the people I think who are very opposed to getting a vaccine, I think the people who are very opposed to going back to normal make up pretty small pieces of the overall pie.
I don't know. That's what I thought for a while, but I keep getting indications that it might be higher than you think.
And we're gonna see, because I hear a lot of people say, weather's turning, fall, or as we get into the end of spring and summer, I keep hearing the proverbial switch is going to be flipped. So we'll see what happens there. Let's talk a little bit about coverage of COVID, and I kind of want to break this up into 3 different chunks: local, regional / TV, and then national mass media. It's been interesting to watch how it's sort of shifted. Local media is still very focused, I think, on when I look at, whether it's what newspapers are covering, whether it's what local digital organizations like ours are doing, it's very focused on sort of the announcements, getting people, keeping people up to date on just what the announcements are from different county officials and things like that. Whereas regional, I'll call it media market TV plus mass media, your CNNs, your Fox Newses, are focusing on the big sort of like scary stuff, whether it's the, oh no, our freedoms are being eroded away on Fox News, or oh no, there's this new dangerous strain coming along that's going to eat us alive. I'm not sure what good the latter does. I'm not really sure what good the mass media approach does. And I know it frustrates a lot of people.
Oh, I know why. I'll tell you. Well, let me start there. First off, all of my liberal friends, turn off your computer and go do something else, because you're going to be mad at me again, because I've been saying these things since day one. There's 2 things that we see in coverage. First was, and now it's coming back again, is the talk about cases. And I made the point that when we talk about cases, what we're really talking about is number of positive tests. Therefore, the more total tests there are, the more positive tests there are going to be, given the same percentage. A lot of my friends on the left dispute that, and I don't understand how you can. That's simple math. If I do 10 tests today and get 1 positive, and I do 100 tests tomorrow and get 10 positives, it hasn't gotten 10 times worse. That's number one. The thing that we're beginning to see now, and the same thing, it's no one's mentioning it. We're beginning to see this rash of stories about how younger people are now getting the virus, to which I say, of course younger people are now getting the virus. Older people are either vaccinated and are immune, or have had it and are immune. If 20% of Americans have been vaccinated, what do you expect the figure is for 60 and up? It's probably 80%. Of course it's going to be younger. Does that mean it's over? No. Does that mean I think it's the flu and nobody should care? No. But we just need to be honest. News media love crises because during times of crisis, people consume media. ABC News Nightline started out of the Iran hostage crisis. Ted Koppel doing nightly reports. Everybody tuned in. After 9/11, we were all tuned in. What's going to happen next? Is my world safe? So there's a vested interest in media to keep creating this crisis. We keep hearing about this variant. This UK variant was known last September. It's been around for 6 months. And I always say, when you watch a media report, watch for the weasel words. Watch for could or might or maybe. When they use those words, that means what we're about to say, we have no proof of it, but we want to say it anyway. Yeah, all right, liberal friends, you can come back now.
I think, the criticism are fair, and I think it kind of boils down to this very sort of simplistic approach to covering the pandemic.
And just one other thing real quick, and that is, why is there so little emphasis on what to me is this remarkable story tens of millions of doses of this vaccine have been given out in just a few months.
Yeah.
Despite the roadblocks, despite the hiccups at the start, I think as a country we've done a pretty good job of getting people vaccinated. And these numbers are going up. Steuben County just opened up a daily clinic, Monday through Friday, 10 to 2 in Bath, with walk-ins.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no excuse anymore. It's 18 and up.
Yep.
And we're seeing more of that. I took my wife, the Ontario County Highway Garage. They've been doing the drive-through ones.
Yeah.
Tremendously well-run thing. You go in, you get it, you don't get out of your car. They put a sticker on your windshield with what time you're allowed to leave after the observation. You drive out, you park. They see your time's come. Okay, you can go. Tremendously efficient. But there's been almost no recognition of that. And then now, today, we're starting to get stories every time someone has a reaction. 20 million people have got vaccinated, but 5 people at a clinic somewhere had a reaction. Oh my God, oh my God. It's just, to my opinion, unbalanced in favor of fear rather than saying we're winning. We're not done yet, but we're winning. COVID-19 is going to be gone sooner than later, maybe in a few months.
Well said. Let's shift gears and talk a little local politics. One of my favorite things to get into here, the function or lack thereal of local industrial development agencies. So the Seneca County IDA, for quick background, has had a vacancy for a couple 3 months. And they've been going through this process of trying to fill it. And there is a lot of contention between the IDA and the Board of Supervisors, of which they serve at the pleasure. So Board of Supervisors, for those who are keeping track at home, Board of Supervisors ultimately has the voting appointment of the individuals who make up the IDA's Board of Directors. They almost had a winner. I want to say a winner. They almost had somebody. Sue Cerencione, who is the owner of the Big M in Ovid, was viewed this appointment, which would have happened officially or finally been finished at the meeting this coming Tuesday, was viewed as kind of like the perfect candidate. Why? From the south end of the county, which typically has less than ideal representation or less than equal representation on the board or various boards. And then also, she was a woman, obviously, and they wanted to make sure there was some diversity on that end as well. But without getting into the politics of it, what we ultimately saw was Cerencione remove herself from consideration after she had already gone through committee, after she had already gone through the vetting process, and appeared to be on the road to appointment. Now, we don't know the why, and we'll probably get more details at that meeting on Tuesday as to why she removed herself. But last week, the Seneca County IDA had to announce that they were going back to the drawing board and requesting for applicants again. Now, officials in Seneca County have said that they're sticking to their guns in terms of wanting someone from the south end and wanting, ideally, a woman to fill that seat. But the question that I wanted to talk about here is there even enough upside for someone who owns a small business to want to get involved with an IDA or any sort of governing body of any sort at the local level? Because it seems like, for better or worse, there's more downside than upside that comes with it. And that seems to be a big shift from what we've seen over the last 40 to 50 years. There's so much distrust with these bodies that I'm not sure that there's enough incentive for someone who's trying to run a business, for everybody, to get involved and to really get engaged, which is sad. That's a sad commentary on the state of politics at any level, because it ultimately means you have less people at the table having a conversation about what should our county or our community look like.
It seems like, particularly in Seneca County, politics have become very personal and driven by feuds and personal disputes. And I think, who wants to get in the middle of that? You feel like, am I going to be able to get this job done? or am I going to have to deal with this person who doesn't like me or doesn't like something I did 2 years ago? And, we've said a few times on this program, I just think the approach is well-intentioned, but it's backward. You don't bring a business in and hope it will find a market. Businesses go where there are markets. The economy and business should be demand-driven. That's why I've said, and it's, now my conservative friends are going to be upset, but I don't think businesses ought to get relief or stimulus money. I think all that money should go to people who should then be free to spend them at whatever businesses they choose. And the ones that make it get to stay in business, and the ones that don't. There's no guarantee when you open a business. You have no right to be in business for life. So it just seems like they're, and like I've said too, it's always the big score. If you're an IDA, you want that headline, new plant coming, 200 jobs. 100 businesses hiring 2 people each isn't a headline. And ultimately, that's where most of your growth comes from. So I just think, I think these people are very well-intentioned. I think it's a very difficult job. And it's also the race to the bottom to see who can hand over more of the town to a business coming in. We'll give you a tax break. Well, this town will give me a bigger tax break. What'll you give me? Well, we'll give you this. Well, they just offered me more. And you wind up with businesses coming to town and paying little or no taxes, or getting, deferred payments or pilot agreements. I think that's just a really difficult job. I don't think I'd want to be involved in it.
Well, and to that end, I mean, we, us in the media, we hear this all the time, right? Like, well, there's never any good news. There's never any good news. IDAs are a perfect example of, the only time you hear about them is when a big business is leaving, a big company is getting a big break, or there's a gigantic announcement, which frankly in rural parts of the Finger Lakes just the big announcements don't come often enough. So the void in the middle is all the downtime. So what you're left with are a lot of people who just genuinely wonder, what are they doing? Like,
and when the big announcement does come, when we follow up 5 years later and check the job promises, I mean, they just don't materialize. I to this day. And it was funny because it was kind of a boilerplate number that they seem to use every place. But Bass Pro, when they opened up in Auburn, I believe the figure they talked about was 3 million visitors annually. They're probably not to 3 million yet. I mean, that was a ridiculous figure. And every time some plant comes in, and it's always some new high-tech thing that we can barely explain, nanotechnology and photonics, and we're going to create 300 jobs. And if you check 5 years later, it's more like 17.
Well, and I think there's also the genuine, and I think well-placed concern that when you don't have new businesses coming in, what you wind up having are a lot of existing businesses getting new breaks and new packages and this, that, and the other thing, which also it gives people reason to have skepticism about what an IDA is doing. And I'm not pointing to Seneca County on this one. I'm literally saying
let's point to Ontario County then. Cherry Bundy.
Right.
Cherry Bundy came in, took all kinds of breaks, set up their business in Geneva, and said thank you very much, and bailed out and went to Michigan.
Yeah, and I understand. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that, I understand this is the system. This is the world we live in. And in New York State, there's no other way to do business right now. But at the end of the day, this is where the criticism is going to be. And I think the answer to the original question is no. We're not going to see a bunch of, people, particularly business owners, lining up and effectively putting their business on the line to give back in a position that's purely voluntary and has not a ton of upside attached to it. Another local semi-political issue here playing out in the Moravia Central School District. Principal Bruce McBain was placed on administrative leave in early March. We got an update to that story this week after he posted a lengthy statement to Facebook. He accused the district of not telling him why he was placed on leave, to which the Board of Education did not respond publicly. The Auburn Citizen did some really good reporting on this one. Obviously, there's a lot of unknown, clearly. But aside from that, I'm really curious because getting back to that whole communication factor that we just talked about, whether you're talking about Chamber of Commerce, whether you're talking about a board of supervisors, a village board, town board, IDA, effective communication nips this in the bud, right? Like this prevents this kind of situation from playing out. But it seems like, again, we see more negative than positive because that's what these bodies ultimately line themselves up for. They line themselves up for negativity, and when it pops out, everybody's just left, staring at each other saying, well, why? It's because bad communication.
Well, elected boards love to hide behind personnel issues because that automatically lets you go into executive session, and it lets you hide it. It seems to me that Mr. McBain is owed an explanation. He says, and we have his version of the story. We don't have the school board's version because they've said nothing. His version is, I've been told there are complaints against me. I said, okay, who and why? And they won't say. So, I mean, it's hard for the school board because you face legal ramifications if you start coming out and accusing him of things and then it's later proven he didn't do any of those things. But it seems like they would owe the public some kind of explanation. I think it was unpaid leave or administrative leave, whatever their exact terminology is, it's been almost a month, I think, was it not? Wasn't it March 15th or thereabouts?
Yeah, it was between the 10th and the 15th.
Right, so this has been going on now for close to a month. It seems at some point the school board owes its constituents and the community some kind of explanation. You don't have to get specific, but you can say, look, we have some complaints we believe are credible, or we have complaints we don't know if they're credible and we're investigating them, or something. It just seems like some kind of explanation is owed, and especially to him, even if it's off the record. I mean, the superintendent or somebody should say, look, Bruce, this is what they're saying, all right? Even if it's off the record to him. I mean, nobody should have to twist in the wind like that.
Well, and to take that a step further, playing devil's advocate, suppose he knows, right? Maybe he knows.
Yeah, that's entirely possible.
Even more reason at that point for the Board of Education to make sure that they've got good messaging on this front, because no comment is not a good solution when the guy you put on leave is out there sharing a 600-word Facebook status on how horribly he's been treated by the district. That just makes you look bad, period.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
It's one of those scenarios, completely avoidable, easily could be fixed, and it's something that all of these boards should be working on all the time. Just good communication so you're never in this situation. And there's going to be a lawsuit no matter what.
The communication's the other part, but also work quickly. Yeah. If there are complaints, how long does it take to find out if these complaints are true? I mean, it would seem to me if there are complaints, you've had enough time to at least determine some of them. So let's say there's 7 complaints and you've investigated 2 of them and found that they're credible.
Yeah.
Then the others are probably credible. Or if you've investigated 2 or 3 and found they aren't credible, then maybe it's time to say, we've looked into this and we think there's nothing there. But do something.
Yeah, and the other part of this too, I think, is with all of the things that we see play out in public in the public discord, there is nothing that this principal could be accused of that would be unsavory to talk about in public. Whether it's something borderline criminal or whether it's just straight up personnel, kind of like personality conflict issues that are that make him a not ideal leader for that particular school. Like, all of those things can be talked about openly. It's not a big deal. All right, let's get to some quick listener questions here that we've collected over the last 2 weeks. You can send those to news@fingerlakes1.com, or you can leave us a voice note using the link in the show notes or in the post on fingerlakes1.com. The first one up is from Cheryl, who asks us about the Geneva Legion property. It's for sale. It's not for sale. It's maybe going to be rehabbed, and the Legion is going to continue operating there. Cheryl asks, what do we think should be done with that property, given that now we're approaching, I think, like year 3 of this kind of ongoing debate about what is or isn't happening with it, and it kind of lives and dies by the functionality of Geneva City Council, which, if you caught any piece of their meeting this week, was not very functional. So I ask you, I have my own thoughts, but I ask you, Ted, what do you think should, to Cheryl's question, be done with that property at this point?
Well, my understanding is, from what I've heard, I think there's now another buyer interested in at least part of it. The problem they're facing, and the problem a lot of these organizations are facing, aging population and declining membership.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful piece of property. It's a valuable piece of property, but the current level of membership just doesn't have the money to maintain it. So, I mean, it seems like you want to find somebody that's going to give you a good bit of money for it, enough that you can, and I know at one point, I believe they were interested in finding another headquarters somewhere, what they call Beans Hill, the area around our radio station, between BJ's and the gas station and that area. So, I mean, it seems like you got to find somebody, and you got to admit that you can't hold this property anymore, as sentimental as it may be and as sad as it might be to the Legion. They just don't have the membership. And I know they've tried. We've had some of them on, talking about recruitment, but it's just it's not an organization that younger people seem to be real interested in joining.
And that's like like you said, to your point, every club/organization.
Right. I mean, we deal
now
with that in Rotary and Lions Club and
yep.
Kiwanis. They're all dealing with the same thing.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those scenarios where City Council let me say this. City Council should pretty quickly try to get a good feel of what the public would like to see done with it, and then have some sort of concrete set of steps that you can lean into. And if Jackie were here, Jackie Augustine would tell me that it's there somewhere buried in some document that nobody ever pays attention to or actually looks at. So you're left with City Council that makes a bunch of like feel decisions instead of like good, solid, fact-based decisions. So I think, you've got to have a plan for the property, and I've seen too many ideas and not enough, this would be a good idea because X, Y, and Z reasons. So I would personally lean toward leave it alone, let it be, until you have the capacity to make a good decision about what you want to do with that property. I've heard, kind of like maybe splitting the property up, rezoning it, allowing for maybe like a hotel or whatever the case may be. That's fine. I was there probably 5 years ago or so for a wedding, and that was the last time I was on the property, but I can almost guarantee that there isn't enough space there to build a new hotel, and I'm pretty sure that the historic preservation folks would lose their mind if someone went in there and said, hey, we're going to wreck this building down.
Yeah, I mean, I think more of an inn, a bed and breakfast kind of thing or a restaurant or something. Yeah, I don't, because it's a fairly narrow piece of property. It's a long, it goes down the hill, beautiful views down to the lake.
And my response to that then becomes, if that's the best use for it, it's not much different than what it's functioning as now. That really is saying it's an event space, more or less, right? Like that's it. So, maybe just try to find someone who's willing to take that on. I don't think you make that decision now in the middle of a pandemic when there's less interest now than there ever has been before in terms of people wanting to get into that space. So let it cool down a bit. I don't think you rush to make a decision, although it seems like there are certain members of City Council who would like to rush and make a decision on that.
But see, and that goes back to, we talked about this several months back in terms of the depot property.
Right.
And it is, what kind of marketing is being done? I mean, is there some way to do nationwide marketing and say, here's this beautiful piece of property? How do we know there isn't somebody sitting in Oregon right now who would like to start a bed and breakfast in a beautiful wine area next to a lake, and they find out about this property and go, look, this is what we've been looking for? I mean, I always question, how wide is the outreach? Is it nationwide, or is it just in New York or just in the Northeast? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the marketing question can be answered very easily because there's just so much out there, and there's so much you're inundated with information and listings and this, that, and the other thing. So I'm not sure how you adequately penetrate a nationwide market. So
and
that
you
can
wonder
really
how many
advertise it.
You wonder how many people in other parts of the country see that and go, oh boy, New York, high taxes, tough business climate. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's tough. Another building and facilities related question from Mark. This week, the historic Sodus Hotel was demolished. Historic is that's generous. He asks, how are small towns going to preserve their history with every structure that has history attached to it getting razed? I don't know. I think communities like Sodus need to pick and choose where they're going to try and preserve their history. I'm not sure there was anything salvageable in the Sodus Hotel, frankly. Otherwise, I think it probably would have been salvaged, right? Like that building hasn't been in very good shape for the last couple decades.
Old doesn't necessarily mean historic either.
Right.
I mean, you have to ask yourself, but it becomes a money question.
Yeah.
You have a Parrott Hall at the Ag Station. I just saw a presentation that, some people were able to come up with enough money to try to do something there, but it costs money to maintain these structures. And unless you can open it as a museum or something and make that money back, where does this money come from? You have these crumbling buildings, the Peter Koch building down right from where we sit here. It was the same thing, Who's going to pay to keep this up, and where's that money going to come from, or how do we make it back? I mean, like I said, if you can open a museum and charge admission or something, maybe you make some of it back. But otherwise, it's great to say we want to preserve all this history, but as we, like you said, in a pandemic, there's no money as it is. Who's going to come up with the money to do it?
But the thing that I think you mentioned Parrott Hall, and I think that's a really good example. Preservation is an everyday job. You don't just get to swoop in when something's about to get demolished and say, but what about preservation?
Right.
It's an everyday job. And I think at the end of the day, the message to the people who say that, who see what happened at the Sodus Hotel and say, man, wish we could have saved that. You've got to be looking for those places every day. Like, you have to be looking for those landmarks in your community every day and working every day to make sure that they're preserved, not just now, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Because this is a building that quite literally went through basically a 100-year catastrophe, more or less, right? Like, it just, over the last century, it just fell apart to nothing. And it was a slow process, yes, but for the last decade or so, it was just an eyesore and nothing else. So,
and then sometimes you have success stories. I mean, the Dove Block at Geneva, they were able to find this office furniture and decorations company out of Philadelphia that's going to come in. They're going to have a gallery of Arthur Dove works. I think maybe some kind of event space involved. So they were able to find the elements to make that pay for itself. That's the problem. I mean, so you fix the Sodus Hotel, now what? And then, like you say, it stands there, and in 20 years, you need a new roof. And then in 20 years, you need, or 50 or whatever, you need another roof. And it just never ends.
Yeah, it's a process. And we always have these conversations. Like, these are for one reason or another, it seems like every week or every couple weeks, there's a building that's at risk of being demolished, and people are very upset about it.
We'd love to save them, but how many people will step up and give $20 or $100 to keep it alive?
Yeah, and there's always a lot of politics involved in a lot of these decisions too, because there's always a lot of municipal effort going into maintaining these spaces, particularly the ones that have become dilapidated and sort of are falling into themselves.
And then what if there's a business that wants to tear it down and become a tax-paying, job-generating business? I mean, it's hard to turn a blind eye to that.
We're looking at you, Circle K. So
exactly.
Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News in Auburn. That's 98.1 FM and 1590 AM WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 FM and 1240 AM WGVA.
All right, that's all for today. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, follow the show on Facebook or YouTube and stay connected with us all week long at FingerLakes1.com. Later, guys.